Hey there, everybody. New studio, new intro. I'm just here to remind you guys before you listen to today's episode, make sure you follow the show and subscribe wherever you listen. If you watch the show on YouTube, make sure you subscribe there, you comment, you like, and you share. Also, follow my social media, all of it, both Instagrams, my Twitter, follow it all. Your life is to be consumed by my life. Tell everybody that you know about me. Start conversations with the fact that the Smoking Simian is your favorite podcast. Bombard everyone that you know and love with the Smoking Simian. Send them links day in and day out of my show, of the episodes, of my posts. Get thrown out of your house because the only thing that you care about is the Smoking Simian. Do it. Enjoy today's episode. Bye-bye. Hey, everyone. Real quick pretense before the show starts. A couple technical errors I made. Some most people won't even notice, but I feel the need to get out there and say it to you. So I know most people listen to the show as opposed to watching the show, but if you do watch the show and if you've watched other Zoom episodes, you will notice that usually it is a side-by-side view of me and then my guest. And this time, for whatever reason, I've forgot to switch that view. So if you're watching the show on YouTube, all you will see is John speaking. I'm obviously also speaking, but you'll only see John. I think maybe this was, it was definitely a mistake and it wasn't intentional, but it might be better than the alternative, which was me being filmed from the side, because again, the whole time, another technical issue that I had overlooked or messed up or whatever we want to call it. I normally put my guest up on my TV, which is right next to my camera facing me, so it looks like I'm, you know what I'm saying, we're face to face. Whereas this time I messed a couple things up. It was early, my first Zoom episode in the new place. I might have been a little more flustered than I had expected myself to be, but nonetheless, me and John had a great episode, a great conversation. I hope you guys agree. And I want to thank John for coming on and helping me put this together. It's been a little bit of a production to get this episode put together, but we were able to do it, and I'm happy we did. And we'll do it again. We'll do it again another point in time, hopefully with less technical follies. But again, I know most people listen to the show. They don't necessarily watch it on YouTube. But if you do, you will notice that all you'll see is John speaking. You'll hear me speaking, but all you'll see is John. I hope it's not too weird. I don't think it is. But I'm done talking. Enjoy today's episode. Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm going to give you guys a little precursor. This is our first time, I guess, doing a guest episode via Zoom in the new studio. And I should have configured it a little better. So I personally won't be looking at the camera the whole time because I got my laptop in front of me. But anyway, we have Professor John Basl from Northeastern University. How are you, my friend? Yeah, you bet. This was quite the extensive process to get it put together, but I'm happy we were able to do it. No problem. I mean, there was, some on my end as well, so not a problem. So first of all, I'd like you to go ahead and, because I've done this before and botched it, so I'd like you to go ahead and tell everyone what your area of expertise is. I know you're a philosophy professor, and you a little more specific in the areas of ethics. So I'd like for you to say kind of what you teach and what you do over at Northeastern.
Yeah, sure, you bet. So my title, I guess, is I'm an associate professor in philosophy, and I'm the associate director in charge of AI and data ethics initiatives at the Northeastern Ethics Institute. And my research is in broadly what we might call moral philosophy, with a special focus on the ethics of emerging technologies, most recently thinking about machine learning and AI ethics, or data and information system ethics. And a lot of my work is about trying to draw on the resources of moral philosophy and think about emerging technologies and see how to apply the resources of moral philosophy to, the way I usually put it, is to realize the promise of technologies while avoiding the ethical pitfalls. And I do that in all sorts of interdisciplinary projects into my research and things like that. And I teach classes in a lot of different areas. I often teach a class called AI ethics, where I talk to students about sort of what is AI, why does it raise problems of justice and fairness or transparency or privacy concerns. I also teach traditional moral philosophy classes where we look at like the history of theoretical views in moral philosophy. Yeah, and that's a rough summary. Happy to follow up on any of that, but that should give the rough idea.
You had mentioned, being able to take advantage of modern technology, but also trying to avoid some of the problems that could come with it, which is, I don't want to say unavoidable, but there are problems that come with any new technology. And that sounds like a pretty fine line to kind of teeter. And we're definitely seeing it with things like AI and, information tracking and that type of thing.
Definitely. It is a fine line, but we're way past the line. Every day is a new headline of some tech company behaving badly or some misuse of a technology. And you're right that there's probably no avoiding bad outcomes, but there's a difference between a bad outcome and a wrong outcome. So like sometimes you do everything you can to get to do the right thing, and a bad thing happens, and then you're sort of excused for that. Like you did your due diligence, almost, is a way to put it. But we're not even in a position where we're real. I mean, there's a lot of people advocating for more responsible technology design and use and more care and better regulations, but we're just mostly failing to live up to that. So a lot of my work is trying to sort of integrate ethics in technology design and use and regulation and oversight, so that we can get to the point where when there's a mishap, it's not because of not trying to do the right thing or not even thinking about doing the right thing. It's because we really tried our best, but we were non-culpably ignorant of some outcome that happened.
Sure. You bring up headlines and that type of thing. I'm sure you heard recently about the dating app Grinder. I don't know if you heard, but they had been selling their information. Their information. They've been selling their users' information to local areas in the, I shouldn't say areas, local bars and restaurants and things that people would use to meet people with dating apps and that type of thing. And as you know, most apps, they track our location.
Yeah.
So that's what, and they're kind of in that kind of hot water. But they had said, and I don't know how redeeming this is, but they're like, oh, we didn't sell it to places where homosexuality is illegal, because it's a dating app for homosexual folks. And it I read it and I was like, this is barely news. I feel like there's always, are there apps that don't sell our information?
Yeah, that's a great. So I don't know much about this case, guys, so I can't speak to like what they sold, but the data economy is just pervasive. Like every company collects data, they sell it to, or they give it to, or they collect it themselves, and they merge it with data from other streams so they can do better targeting in search and ads and things like that. So are there companies not selling data? Probably, but the majority of them, I mean, this is why we get access to a bunch of free services. So like Gmail is cost a lot of money to run. They give you a lot of space. There's a lot going on there, but your data, our collective data, no individual's data is worth that much, but our collective data is just worth so much money. So they can give us free services like Google Maps and Google Docs and Gmail for, in quotes, free, because of the data economy that is often sort of two steps back from what any user is really thinking about or worried about. So yeah, it's in a certain sense, you're right that it's barely even news that this happened. I mean, the more recent thing that's in the news is worries about pregnancy tracking. Period cycle tracking apps, given the SCOTUS decision, because some people are already suggesting that you could figure out whether a woman is seeking or has gotten an abortion on the basis of their tracking data.
Really?
Yeah, that's that's starting to make the headlines. And I think, yeah, so first when the SCOTUS decision leaked, I wasn't really thinking about the technological aspects, but then I got an email from a colleague, Pat Williams. She's a leading technology scholar and legal scholar. And she was like, we should all be thinking about the technological dimensions of this. And I was like, yep. And then I started seeing the headlines about the tracking apps, and it's a, yeah, but it's a similar kind of issue, right? Like, this ends up like, we often think of privacy. We have a very old school notion of privacy, which is something like, there's certain ways to anonymize my information, and that protects my privacy. Like, if you don't have my social security number and my birth certificate, my data is private. But the way big data works is that they can make really invasive, machines, algorithms can make really sensitive or invasive inferences on the basis of what seems like mundane information about you. Or I have some really sensitive information about you, and then I get a piece of mundane information about somebody else, and now I can infer really invasive things about that person, including maybe sexual preference or pregnancy status and things like that.
Where does something like this start? Like, I feel, because the last episode I did, I feel like as long as people are entertained, and as long as they're able to kind of do what everyone likes to do on social media, and that's post things about their life and post opinions, that type of thing, I feel like a lot of people are blind to these kind of intrusive actions that are being taken by these big companies. Where does this kind of start?
Yeah, you mean where does the solution start?
Well,
like how does
yeah,
it
how
happen?
did this get to this point? Because I'm young. I wasn't around when I was born when AOL was like starting to phase out. So
yeah.
In those days, was it as intrusive? Were things as intrusive? Like, when did this kind of get to this point where data is so commodifiable?
Yeah, this is a standard academic answer, but I'd want to ask like a historian of technology to be precise. But it's relatively recent. It's certainly, I mean, targeted ads have been around for a long time, and data analytics have been around for a long time, and building models that allow us to make sort of like, the insurance industry is built on building really accurate models for really strange circumstances, right? Like, you get insurance for floods or for climate stuff. Like, so like this kind of tool has been part of our repertoire for a long time. But what's really happened post that AOL moment, like during your lifetime, is the ability to amass huge amounts of data that lets you mine them for correlations that let you do this kind of privacy invasive inference, or to use it for really important decision making. So before, we didn't have enough data to make accurate. So there are recidivism prediction algorithms, for example, that like, you put in someone's police record and it will tell you how much a risk they are to violate parole. You need a ton of data to do that kind of thing. And so it's only in the time when we've had a lot of people using the internet and a lot of ability to store and comb through that data, or build and advances in computer science that build algorithms to learn on the basis of that data, that you really face the current instantiation of this problem. It's not necessarily a new problem, but its pervasiveness has grown. What's going to get people to it's like, part of the problem is a little bit hidden, right? Because the data breaches don't feel that, or like the ways in which these companies make invasive inferences are almost, in a certain sense, hidden from you. Like, we're in other areas where we have really robust regulation. I don't know. So like biomedical research, like we have really robust protections for human subject research, and we have really robust protections for animal subject research. But that only came about because of really in your face violations of rights. In the case of animal subject research, people were having their dogs kidnapped or taken or stolen and then sold to medical research facilities. And this ultimately led to oversight for animal research. And in the human case, there's just, a whole history of abuse of patients. And then eventually something happens. But here it's harder to see what that's going to be, because the headlines come out every day, and it just doesn't feel, it's not like my dog gets stolen. It's like hard to see the ways in which I'm violated by the things these companies are doing.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's not concrete, like you're saying. It's almost like an abstract idea.
Yeah, and some of the problems are just broadly social, and we're just really bad at thinking about like, or being in impact. Like, so climate change is a good example of this. Like, it's hard to feel the impact individually unless you're in one of the places that gets flooded, or it's hard to see, it's hard to connect the global phenomena of climate change, for example, with the discrete climate disasters. And so collective problems are really hard for us. So like, one of the biggest scandals associated with big data is Cambridge Analytica, where people were getting targeted ads trying to influence their vote. But it's hard for us to feel as an individual like I was attacked personally or something like that. I mean, we're just bad at, we just don't think that way typically, I
Right.
think.
And I mean, where you probably could factor in that we're so used to it at this point that it's not even, we know for sure that if we talk about, you know, something specific around our phone, or if we searched something one time, or you clicked on one ad, we know that we're probably going to get a plethora of things related to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. There it is. You're totally right that it's sort of like the ways in which these tools sort of collect our information and use our information is just sort of part of our background experience of the internet or social media. But at the same time, where people are incredibly skeptical of the tech companies. So like at the start of the pandemic, together, Google and Apple, alongside some other people, developed a COVID tracking app. And it was a piece of software you put on your phone, and it sort of could tell when you were near someone that then tested positive. But technologically, it was kind of a marvel because it was really privacy preserving, because they knew no one was going to use this thing if it didn't protect privacy. So like all the data was kept only on your device, and Google couldn't have access to it. Apple couldn't have access to it. So it was a really robust system, but nobody would use it because they're like, no, Google and Apple are just collecting our data. Meanwhile, they're clicking on things that are giving them their data for free, 5 minutes later. So it's sort of this weird, like everyone knows the tech companies are doing it and doesn't like it. But then you're right that like in our device use, like in our everyday behavior, we don't do much. And I'm included. Like I don't do much to protect my privacy or to not give up that kind of data, mostly because it's extremely convenient.
Well, that's the thing. It's, I mean,
Yeah.
how can you? Sure, maybe back in the day when, I always use cell phones as an example, or even texting. When I first got a cell phone, I was in, I don't know, the third grade or something, and everyone in my family, nobody wanted texting. Nobody would, no, just call me, just give me a call. And now, you can't not text.
Can't pay people to
Yeah,
call you. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Like the pitch I often give about like how do we solve or think about these problems is like other areas where we do a better job on the ethics side. We have whole ethics ecosystems. That means there's good policy and regulation. People working in the area are raised into or grown into a sort of set of norms and standards that they're supposed to apply in their work. You have robust scholarship trying to investigate the area and find ethical flaws and resupport those norms. You have, perhaps most importantly, interdisciplinary people that they're not like, they don't belong to any discipline, they belong to all the disciplines. So they can sort of, they understand the technologies like that they're opining over, like medical technologies. They understand ethics, they understand sociology, they understand all these things, and they can speak to all the different actors and sort of translate between them. And in the tech thing, we just don't have any of that. So like we need regulation. We need better, like people don't really understand how machine learning works, and the way that like they know that if they click a targeted ad, they're going to get more targeted ads, but they don't really understand exactly how these technologies work and the way that they contribute to the kind of privacy invasions or justice invasions or other kinds of ethical challenges that we face. So we need a better educated group of stakeholders. We need researchers that understand each other. We need interdisciplinary scholars. And so there's not a single, like, and in solving just one of them, like for example, like the Google and Apple COVID tracking app, like that addressed one, like they actually was a privacy preserving technology. But without the other pieces, without the public understanding enough to see that that was happening, it just became ineffective. So like there's like a ton of work to do. We got to build up every part of the system.
Now, Apple was one of the companies that, and I don't know if Google does this with their phones, but a year or a year and a half ago or something, they allowed people to sort of not. How do I want to word this? You had kind of like a choice on whether or not you could be tracked by Apple, which
That's
is
right.
essentially, I mean, that's a big step, especially for a company that it's a tech company, the biggest tech company in the world, one of the biggest tech companies in the world.
Yeah. So it was a super interesting decision. I mean, in part, one reason Apple can get away with that is because their funding source comes from people buying stuff, and their funding source doesn't depend on them collecting data. Of course, they collect data. They want to do things with Siri. That depends on lots of data. That's an NLP system, a natural language processing system. So they do depend on data for all sorts of things, but it's not their main revenue model. Like they sell devices, they get a cut of the app store. They have a whole ecosystem that they can sell to. Whereas Google, really gets its money from ads. And so Google does have some privacy protections, but Facebook wasn't nearly as worried about them as they were about the Apple decision, because the Apple's privacy protections, or tracking protections, I should say, were pretty strict. And sometimes if you turn on that feature in your phone, it'll set, like, the company itself that makes the Apple have a little thing that's like, by you doing this and us not getting data, it might hurt our ability to provide services in the future. Because like, it's a big deal for Facebook to be able to track a bunch of things about you. So yeah, the data, like, who the players in the data economy and where their revenue comes from is pretty interesting, and it sort of shapes what they're willing to do in terms of giving you tools to protect your data.
Yeah, and I'm happy you brought up Facebook, because Facebook's a scary one in my opinion. I don't use Facebook a ton, but there's people who live on Facebook, and they can track your information by just having an account. Forget the fact that
That's right.
Hey, checking in at so and so place, and I went here to buy this and all this. They've clearly been in hot water for a while, but here's the thing. I go back to my point where people love it. People love being on Facebook. They love the ability to have a voice and have an opinion and this type of thing. And then there's people like me who want no part of those, opinions or any of that stuff. But it's hard to boycott something that, people sell things on Facebook. You have businesses on Facebook. You have Facebook pages for your job that you have to follow because of announcements and this type of thing. It's hard to boycott something like that.
Absolutely. And in some places, some countries, and for some people, even in any country, Facebook is the main portal to the web. Like, the web equals Facebook for some people. It's how they learn about every website. It's their access to all news stories. It's their primary entry point to the internet. And so the more people that's true of, it becomes especially problematic when you don't have good filters for misinformation, or there's election interference going on via the platform itself. So they're an instance that's in the news all the time. And I think, I don't know what the solution is. Like, at some point you might need regulation. You're right that it's very hard for individuals to do much. I mean, even getting off the platform, they own other platforms. They have access to all sorts of data streams. They're creating new data streams by selling headsets to virtual reality. Individual boycotts are probably not the solution, or at least not part of a full. They're just, if anything, they're just part of a solution. But you're right. It's for some people, it's not a realistic, like, them boycotting Facebook is removing the possibility of them achieving some real values. Like, for some people, it's a real tool for deep social connection. For some people, it's a real tool for being able to sell things. Maybe they make a living via Facebook. So it's like, giving up Facebook comes at significant, not for us, me and you can get off Facebook and it probably comes at little cost, but for some people, getting off Facebook comes at serious cost.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they mastered the social media virtual world. At this point, they've mastered it up until this point.
Who knows? Yeah. I mean, these things can collapse sometimes. You're right. But yeah, just like, everybody occasionally will try to organize a migration to a different website. But if not everybody goes at once, you just don't have the critical mass. It just ends up being a wasteland.
Yeah. Like, I remember being in middle school, and MySpace was the thing. We were all in, and even before that, elementary school, it was AIM. Everyone was on AIM and messaging back and forth, and then it was MySpace. And then it is funny, though, because there are social media apps that do kind of phase out. But right now, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, those are like the big three. And I know Facebook owns Instagram, but those are like the big three. And Facebook, I mean, 4 billion people, there's 4 billion users. Doesn't mean there's 4 billion people using it, but
it's an important distinction. Yeah.
Right. And that's another thing. I mean, the fact that there are so many, I guess you can say, for lack of a better term, provocateurs in these spaces, especially like Facebook.
Yeah. Or Reddit.
Reddit, another big one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
There just isn't, as far as Reddit goes, I don't spend a ton of time on Reddit, which is probably good. But I mean, there's not nearly as much that you can do on any app compared to Facebook. You can put videos and pictures and you know, statuses. You can
Yeah, you could be on there and not have to leave that for your internet usage for in many ways.
right
Yeah, that's right.
now. Another thing that's nerve wracking about all this is that, you know, we kind of started this conversation with targeted ads, and that has become the premier way to market. Years and years ago, there was the term of blanket marketing, where, you know, you put you know, drink Coke, everybody's going to drink Coke, that type of thing. But now
Yeah.
it's super, and I'm sure companies that are taking advantage of this can't see any other way right now, to really bring in revenue, which is dangerous. I mean, the corporations' main focus is to make money for the shareholders and turn over high profits. And if breaching information and getting these targeted ads to people is what's doing it, then good luck, you know?
Yeah, I mean it's a real problem that might require regulation, but the problem, I mean, like, what's important to see is that the way this causes a kind of disunifying of experience. So when you have blanket ads, we're all subject to the same ads. But when you have targeted ads, and the more targeted they get, what I see is different from when you see what you see. And then that lesson easily apply once you see that there's a tight relation between, for example, ads and content. Like, my putting content on the page that you're interested in makes it more likely that you stick around that page and see my ads. Then we move right towards targeted content. And then they're like, the news stories you see and the news stories I see might be radically different. And we end up in different, there's some good scholarship on this. T. Wynn is a philosopher who's sort of drawn this distinction between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. But this is the phenomena that leads us to sort of be in totally different, what philosophers call epistemic spaces, like where our beliefs are, how our beliefs are formed, the news we're getting are just not, we're not experiencing the world the same way. And so it becomes really difficult for us to talk to one another. Or we, at least when we try to, we're coming from entirely different places, and they're just constantly being reinforced by the media that we get. And so even before, if you thought the media was one-sided, at least we all had a common place to start from. Like, I could expect that you saw roughly the same headlines that I did, or the same, if there was an outrageous story, I can expect that everybody had seen it. And now, like, you get in a debate with someone and they'll bring up some news article from that, like, wasn't even possibly on your radar. Like, it's just not part of your information stream. And that's a real challenge. And it's fed by this targeting problem, right? So it's just like targeted ads, you get targeted content, and it leads you down these paths.
That's a good point about news and what kind of news we get, because we live in a time where the news is, they're more focused on ratings. They're not focused on trying to get the actual news story out. So you're absolutely correct in the fact that one person could hear this about a news story and someone else is like, well, I heard this about it, and now there's who's right, like, what is the truth? And that's where a lot of these a lot of the tension comes from. I think that's why people are so tense about certain topics, and I mean, you saw it throughout COVID. If there was anybody speaking about COVID in a way that the common narrative wasn't abiding by the common narrative, then they get silenced, or they get their videos taken down, or if they're making money on YouTube, now they're getting demonetized. And it's kind of crazy how these apps do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's like, there are advantages to this sort of decentralization of media. Like, more people can create content, and there's maybe new checks and balances against news. At the same time, when you find out that a little bit of when there's targeted misinformation and it can lead to massive number of public deaths, like, you got to start balancing, like, people's freedom of expression on platforms versus public health crisis. And that's a hard problem. And then there's better and worse kinds of censoring. And to one of the things that I think needs to be done is, like, when I was talking about sort of building in ethics into the design of products, is like being really thoughtful about how you're going to do censorship, or how you're going to filter content, or how you're going to measure truth or falsity, or when something is directed misinformation. And we could do a lot better job at that. And there's people working on technical solutions to those kinds of things. But we got to make sure, for example, one of the problems when you start enforcing sort of censorship is there's a tendency that already marginalized communities tend to get punished more, just because the filters end up just being worse at recognizing like sort of this sort of linguistics or the way that people talk to each other in sort of those kinds of communities, because it's not part of the main data set. And so you run into all sorts of fairness kinds of problems that you end up limiting speech, incorrectly limiting the speech of people who already have unequal access to free speech.
Right.
So yeah, it's a really hard problem.
It's also interesting that there's no real push to maybe redefine free speech in the sense of because now there's all these the rise of social media and technology and that type of thing. There's been no I don't want to say amendment, but the idea of free speech, I myself, I believe in no censorship. Personally, I'm a comedian. I'd like to think of myself as an artistic minded person, and I feel that anytime someone puts something out there, I feel like anyone should be able to do it. But there hasn't been any kind of changes when it comes to the idea of free speech. There hasn't even really been much of a conversation when it comes to people on these social media platforms being able to say or do what they want. As far as
I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, there are certainly conversations behind the scenes about how to limit or what not to limit. And certainly what companies will say is that they want to give people free speech on these platforms. I mean, they're private platforms. And so like, it's weird for these companies to appeal to sort of, this is the thing, like this often happens in our minds. We have a basic protection of free speech, but like within the Constitution, that's a protection against the government. The government's not allowed to limit my speech in certain
Right.
ways. But like like in my house, I can say things like, we're not allowed to talk about that, or you can leave. So it doesn't like the protections for free speech don't protect against that. And I mean, one thing I think you're right about is that we need to rethink our core values in light of the way these technologies work. So privacy is the example I gave earlier, where it's like there were privacy protections like anonymizing people's social security number, birth date, things like that. Like that's actually a pretty good privacy protection for a bunch of the ways we used to use technology. It just doesn't serve the value of privacy anymore. And it's true that we need to reflect on all our values that way and think about, are the standard, so like in medical research, informed consent is like a standard tool for protecting people's autonomy. Like the things that medical researchers would do to you would be assault if you didn't give informed consent, right? In the case, so we've taken that tool and we've applied it to the internet, and now you click agree to things. But that's just like nobody, like in the medical context, you make sure that people understand what's about to happen to them. You have to have certain kinds of disclosures that they can understand. You have to make sure there's no coercion. But in the notice and consent case, like when you click agree to some piece of software or the internet, like it's all written in legalese that you don't read and nobody reads. And so like, it's just a bad tool for protecting the thing that's actually, it's a good tool in one context and a bad tool in this context. And so I think you're absolutely right that we need to rethink how we protect things like freedom of expression in this new context. Now, I don't have nuanced views about censorship or not, but I do think there are certain contexts where it would be wrong to censor. So like artistic expression in certain contexts, comics I think should have great amounts of leeway as a part of artistic expression. Except at the same time, like, you know, it'd be I expect students not to come into my class and just start screaming their opinions for fun, right? Like, you know, so there's like context where we think it's okay to limit expression because it's an obstacle to achieving something we think is valuable if people are just allowed to say whatever they want whenever. And then there's other places where we think the value to be had from that expression is the good that we want. Like that's the thing that gets us what we want. And so I think what we really have to think about is like, what is social media for, and what goals is it meant to help us achieve? And is it best served by limiting speech in certain ways or not? And I don't have an answer to that question. Like it's the kind of thing I'd want to spend about 5 years thinking about before I stated even a mild opinion about. But I think that's the approach we got to take, which is like, we have to basically start from the ground up and think about, in these contexts, what are the goods that are on the table? What are the bads that are on the table? And how do we weigh them against one another?
Yeah, I feel like context it's a huge word today because of how much information we have. And that's where the censoring thing is strange, because you could have a podcast or a conversation or something with a completely qualified person, but and the context is good. We're talking about, a certain area, and if you were to watch the whole thing instead of taking this little piece, which is what a lot of these apps do. If you mention one thing on YouTube about, I had a joke on here one time, me and another guest. I was like, we're going to get taken down because of this, all right? Anti-vax. I just said the word anti-vax, and I didn't get taken down. But, that's kind of what was going on. If I had a bigger following, then, hey, the video could have gotten taken down just for that one word, because they kind of have these algorithms that pick this one thing. And I get it. It's hard. How are you going to sift through everything and sit down and find the context? But if you can, in my mind, I feel like if you can make an algorithm that can pick that one word out, maybe you can create an algorithm that can find context as well, maybe.
I mean, I'm sure people are working. You're right there's a huge technical problem here. Like, how do we sift through however many YouTube videos and podcasts there are to do flagging correctly? And I think there's many contexts where companies are over eager to flag, partly for legal reasons, like so DMCA takedowns, right? Like, you just say someone's using copyrighted material, and the response is to just strike the content without checking to see if that's actually true. So it can be weaponized. So you're right that you got to be careful about managing it. So like one thing you could do is like, and this is why I think the warning label solution is not so terrible. So like if all you're doing is flagging, saying like, well, this video might have some misleading content about this thing, and then the person can listen and hear that you clearly made a joke and you're saying like, here's how content gets flagged, then they can make a judgment, right? That's very different than a more restrictive thing where they actually take it down until they check the context. But again, it's going to be like, it's a lot of the context matters a lot. Like, I don't, if someone's got millions and millions of listeners, and they're that it makes sense to be more strict about how your filter works and how carefully you listen to the content, because the cost of getting it wrong is a lot higher.
Right. That's also true. Because there are people who are being a little more deliberate with the information that they're putting out there, and they're trying to run a certain narrative. Everybody's got to have a scheme. So if you can run a certain narrative for your brand or for your show or whatever, then people will do it, and you got people following you. And then, this leads to things like, just an example, it leads to, like Wall Street bets, which,
yeah, right.
I'm all for the small guy getting one in on the big guy, always. But you could use that for worse. You could use that for terrible things.
Yeah. You get a diamond hand meme, and then all of a sudden everyone's selling their stocks and everything crashes. Yeah, right.
Precisely. Or even, the organization of people going over to the Capitol. I mean, we're fortunate that there was nothing, super bad that happened, but it could. It very well could. And there are people who, and like we mentioned before, there are provocateurs, and there's bots and that type of thing that are there specifically to cause tension between people.
Yeah, I think the Capitol case is a good case. I mean, like, we're lucky things weren't worse. Things were pretty bad, but it was indicative of behind the scenes much worse. And the people, you're right that there was an incentive for people to sort of influence sort of citizens to go do that. And they did it, and they had a lot of influence and power, and they, caused an insurrection.
Right. And then you think of all the peaceful protests or the well organized movements that can be done through this type of technology and through this ability to connect with people. So again, context. It's they got to find.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, one of the challenges we face is like, I mean, what everyone wants. I work with a lot of tech people, and what they want is just like, can you just tell me the principle I'm supposed to follow whenever I'm doing anything? And I'm like, that's not how these things work. Like, there are some broad principles, but how you actually realize or live up to that principle varies depending on what you're doing. So like what fairness is a big one. Like a lot of people in AI really concerned with what are called fairness metrics. Like, how do I evaluate my algorithm's fairness? And the conversation me and my colleagues always have to have with them is like, fairness means different things in different contexts. Sometimes what we care about is having a fair process. Sometimes what we care about is distributing something fairly. And those are very different. If you're dividing a cake, you want to make sure that people get a fair distribution. When you're deciding who's guilty or innocent, you want to make sure you have a fair process. You don't care. You don't want the distribution to be equal. You don't want to make sure like, well, we need at least 50 guilty votes and 50 innocent votes. No, that's not what you care about. You care that the process is fair. So like context matters a ton, and what kind of value, how a value gets realized matters by context. And so you're like, there's just not going to be the like, here's the rule for all of social media, right? Because there's just different things going on. And that's one, like how you, like context complicates things. It makes doing ethics hard. It makes getting the right answer harder. So yeah, it's a real problem.
Now, I feel like a big concern when it comes to AI and machine learning and this type of thing is that, and I don't know, you're much more in the space than I am, but as a person and people that I speak to, I think people are nervous about these type of technologies kind of, for lack of a better term, making the physical world and the human a little more, I don't want to say completely obsolete, but kind of on the back burner, like welcome to the machine type thing, you know?
Yeah.
I think people have kind of this dystopian view of what could happen if AI kind of runs amok. Is this a common concern?
Yeah, so I think I'm probably out of touch with what most people worry about when it comes to AI because I, work on very specific problems. But I think that like that is a significant worry. So like, it's like when I don't even know how people typically think of what AI is. But first of all, this is already happening. It's displacing labor and things like that. But AI is everywhere, including in like, for example, autonomous vehicles. You can't have them without AI.
Sure.
So like the future of work, people should genuinely be worried about the ways this is going to displace things like employment and decision making. And there is a lot of work on sort of, we know that there are a bunch of what we call decision systems or algorithmic decision making systems, where we sort of have an algorithm make a probabilistic judgment about a likely outcome or something like that, like recidivism prediction or employment, or loans. So we use automated algorithmic systems there. And there's lots of worry about not just it taking people's jobs, but just like giving up that kind of decision-making power to a non-human. Like it feels like there are contexts where it's really important that another person be making these decisions about you. And we know that even though, so like a lot of people's solution to this is to have hybrid systems so that the algorithmic system is just sort of one piece of information that a hiring manager gets, or it's one piece of information that a loan maker gets, or it's one piece of information that a judge gets. Or in doctors use these things too for medical diagnostics. It's just one piece. But we know that when people get an automated decision from a system, they think of it as objective and they sort of end up deferring to it. So we end up giving a lot of power to algorithms, even though even when they're meant to just be a support system. And so there's lots of work being done to figure out how can we make them genuine support systems, because they can be really helpful. Like medical diagnostic tools based on AI can be really helpful in solving certain problems if we know how to integrate them into decision making in the right way. They can also be extremely problematic if we just say like, well, the algorithm said it, so let's do it. So yeah, it's a problem on the labor market. Like, will automated systems displace employment? So for example, automated trucks, autonomous vehicles in trucking industry. Trucking is a major employment sector. Sure. So it would be a significant displacement of labor if all of a sudden we're turning over all the driving to autonomous trucks. And then in decision-making context, there is a genuine worry that these machines have too much decision-making power and we're sort of giving up decision-making to these systems. And unfortunately, they're not better decision makers in many, many ways.
Right. I mean, it's very true that I think we have kind of ran away with this idea of algorithms being kind of this mathematical truth, this scientific proof of whatever it is that we're engaging in, like you said, medical diagnostics and in the law sector and all those things, and it can be very problematic because people look at these things and they're like, we've spent a lot of time on creating this algorithm and it's 98% correct or 90 almost perfect. There's no human error in this, where before it would take years of a collection of scientists and peer reviewed work to have any kind of theory emerge as a popular one, where now we can have a few really smart tech guys, I guess, and they could put something together based on all this data that they've collected.
That's right. Yeah, I think like that's a really powerful, like one of the reasons I push this idea that like we need people to understand machine learning better is that like people think of algorithms as these if they think about algorithms at all, they think about them as sort of someone builds a thing that goes from point A to point B and they just carefully map that out. Like sort of like you tell the algorithm what kinds of inputs generate what kind of outputs. But machine learning is not like that. It's much more like training a dog, where like you sort of shape the behavior and you tell it when it does a good job and when it does a bad job, and you just hope for the best when you leave your house. And the more you train it, the more likely it's going to be to respond to commands outside the house. But it could be getting things wrong. I don't know. It's like one of my favorite examples is like if you read a good dog training manual, it'll make sure to tell you not to bob your head when you say sit, because you don't want the dog to think that the nod of the head is the command. Right. And so like that's exactly what happens in machine learning. The machine learning algorithm can pick up in the data set the weirdest things. And that's what it's basing its decision on. And so like there's this expression in computer science, bias in, bias out. So like the data sets are from flawed things. Like the data sets that medical diagnostic algorithms are trained on are based on the decision making of humans. Now they're doctors, so they're probably pretty careful about their training set. But if you're thinking about like other sorts of data, it's not surprising, for example, that when you try to do a crime prediction algorithm, that it tends to locate police in minority neighborhoods because you're basing it on past policing that was often racially motivated.
Sure.
And so you end up, so it's not surprising that you get that kind of data. And it's not that surprising if you're not careful that it'll end up being sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you put more police in those neighborhoods, they make more arrests, then the algorithm learns that that's the place where arrest gets made. So you have to be very careful when you build these things, or you get feedback loops and you just recapitulate biases in the previous data.
Well, that's an interesting point, because as you mentioned, all the data is coming from us flawed humans, and it's learning based on what the people are giving it. And again, like you said, there are the example of the police. It's an example of where a human ideal can affect this tech, this kind of abstract thing in an algorithm. Yep.
Yeah, they can only learn with what they're given, and what they're given is usually not great. Like the way that computer scientists try to overcome this is why we've needed lots of data. Like you try to overcome idiosyncrasies in the data by just having tons of it, and you hope the idiosyncrasies come out in the wash. But when you have things like systemic problems that sort of pervade the whole data set, you're in trouble. And so I think it's really important that people understand that algorithms aren't just objective things. There's a certain sense in which they are just a piece of math, but they're a piece of math that learns on not math. And so that's one reason to be very skeptical about them in all sorts of contexts. Like, a famous case, Amazon they spent a lot of money on a hiring algorithm. Turns out it was only basically hiring men, even though it was not given access to, it wasn't told, nobody in the data. It was, they were hiding man, woman in the data set, but it was picking up on things like if they went to a woman's college or if they played a woman's sport, like field hockey or something like that. It was just like, no. So it like, because there's these correlations through the data between particular genders or particular races or particular other social groups and other what seem like features that don't really bear on anything, because there's correlations in the data set, it's going to draw on those correlations.
It is strange that we've put so much trust and we look at these behind the scenes things such as algorithms. We look at them as a way to get rid of human error, when in actuality they're learning based on humans.
Yep. Yeah.
Now, something else I wanted to ask you about while we're on the topic of weird technology, I guess.
All right.
This idea of Web3. I don't know how well versed you are in this space. I'm sure you're, more so than I am. But what is kind of what is it? I guess essentially, it's another new technology that sounds incredibly abstract that people are. It's the beginning of, so everyone's skeptical, and I feel like it's something that, just like cell phones, just like social media, just like television, eventually people are going to come around to it being a normality.
Yeah, so it's a space that I don't follow very closely. You know, you can only direct attention in a few places, and every time someone starts talking about it, they have a different definition of what it is, and it's the same with the metaverse, which is where I have done a little bit of thinking.
Sure.
But so I actually don't know. I don't have a clear definition of what it is or whether it's going to become a thing or not. I mean, certainly people are throwing lots of money at it and lots of sort of I don't know, social capital at it. Like there's like big players describing it and saying it's the next big thing. But I'm actually, like NFTs, Web3, and Metaverse, I've mostly sort of not been focusing on Metaverse a little bit because of some projects I think about in VR, virtual reality and augmented reality. But I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately. I'm just not sure what it's going to amount to or what I'm not even sure if you ask 50 people what Web3 is, I think you'd get 50 different answers. And that could be people who are Web3 people.
Sure.
So yeah, it's outside of my area, unfortunately.
So what have you come across when in your metaverse thinking and research? What have you come across there? Because virtual reality is that's very real. That's happening for sure.
Yeah, what the uptake is going to be like. I mean, there are barriers to entry, right? Like you can't get 4 billion people on there just yet because the devices are so expensive, and there's some rumors coming out that Facebook is finally going to have one where the resolution is so crisp you could do things like code or write in there. You couldn't do that right now, but yeah, the thing I think about there is I just think there's a real potential that it amplifies the problems we already face in AI. So take information and disinformation. The thing we were talking about before about the unity of experience. Like already we have disunified experience. Like what you see on social media is different from what I see on social media. But if we're both walking around with augmented reality glasses or spending our time in VR, it's even more so. Like the entirety of our experience can be totally unshared. Like even when we're in the same virtual space together, we're not going to see the same things, right? I might have a filter that makes you look like a kangaroo. You might have a filter that makes me look like a barber's pole. Who knows, right? So like we lose out. I worry that we lose out on shared experience. I also worry, one of my colleagues, Katie Creel, she has this stuff on what's called algorithmic monocultures. So the idea is this, that like sometimes everybody makes arbitrary decisions. And she says sometimes the arbitrariness is fine, but when one algorithm, the same arbitrariness is being used across the whole range of decisions, it can systematically exclude people on the basis of arbitrary reasons. Let's just say like as an employment manager, I tend not to hire people who wear purple shoes, right? And you might think, well, that's a very stupid reason not to hire someone, but like we all have weird biases. And as long as someone's willing to hire people with purple shoes, you're not out of a job if you wear purple shoes. But if we're using an algorithm that doesn't like purple shoes and everybody's using the same algorithm, then that person with purple shoes just can't get a job.
Right.
Now imagine that one platform owns almost all of VR and their algorithms decide everything. So you've got a single person or a single company that sort of controls what appears for everybody. And if there's an economy in there, its algorithms making all the decisions about that economy. Then you start to worry about these decisions at scale in a way that systematically excludes people. So imagine you can take this to speech, right? So like there's always going to be some random flagging of people speech or censoring their content just because it picks up one time you said anti-vax in a session of whatever you're talking on in VR. But as long as when you move to another platform or you do another thing that the algorithm misses it, whatever, you're not being totally blocked out of conversations. But if one algorithm is making the decisions all the time, you could be systematically excluded from participating in certain things.
Yeah, no, that's I guess the problem with a monopoly like that. I mean, ultimately that, for lack of a better term, that's what it is. I mean, it's a monopoly on, and again, it's right now we're at the bottom level of this technology, it seems like.
That's right. Yeah.
So it could in the future we have different companies that are making different algorithms that will be a little more inclusive.
Yeah, I think the fight about metaverse, I think what everyone's fighting for about the metaverse and probably Web3 is like who's going to control it. And part of the point is that these things can be disunified and everyone can have local, like the metaverse is supposed to be like the web, where like people have their part of the web, but it's like a free space in some sense. Like nobody owns the web. But the worry about the metaverse is that the first person to get there and build up the platform that people want to be on is going to have a lot of power over, it could end up being a monopoly, and it could end up being like sort of almost an invisible monopoly in the sense that you'll allow other people within the metaverse to do things like they'll set up their virtual shops, and you might have an economy with lots of different actors in there, but it's all powered by a single platform. Like it's all going through a single platform. And I think the worry is about, is that what these places are going to end up looking like or not?
Right. I think another worry for someone like me definitely is people are going to have an avatar, and their avatar will now be pristine. It'll be everything that, whatever their shortcomings are in life, whatever they wish they had or whatever, they'll now have a world where they can have all these things. And it sounds dystopian, but that for me and a lot of other people I've spoken to is a worry. It's a fear that the physical world and the world outside of the metaverse will look less appealing.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've talked with this about some people, and it's sort of, I'd say it's like mixtopian, because there's some sense in which that gives people a lot of freedom.
Right.
Like, like me being able to express myself in different ways, or like show myself in a different light, or pass as one thing or another and not be judged because of my skin tone. Not that that happens to me. I'm but but indigenous populations, Black people, like it could be extremely freeing to not have that be the thing that people see you
Sure.
as. People with disabilities, right? And so I think there's a real challenge about, and this is the same with like real names versus pseudonyms on social media platforms. There's cost and benefits to allowing people control over the way they express themselves, or identify as, or how they identify. And there are goods and bads to come with different. It's a matter of context. It is. This is also a problem in the real world, right? Like certain people do have access to make changes to their body in certain ways that let them present themselves differently. And here it just expands that problem and makes us think about it across a range of different kinds of interactions. And so people are thinking about this, and I've just started thinking about it. But again, I think it's a case where, yeah, we got to think about how our identity interacts with our avatars, and whether we want to control what kind of avatars people are allowed to have. Like certainly we don't want people to be able to shape an avatar that lets them take advantage of people. But we want to let people identify in ways that allow them access to certain goods that they might not otherwise have access to. I mean, part of the promise of a place like the metaverse is that it affords people opportunities they otherwise wouldn't have. Like one of the things that I hope comes out of the pandemic is that people have greater access to educational opportunities because they can participate virtually in some cases. Now, I don't love that form of classroom interaction, but I do love that people who otherwise couldn't join a class or couldn't go to school in a certain place or couldn't be in a classroom with certain professors now possibly can. Like it's now on people's menu of options that they can offer to people. I have so many virtual meetings with students from other universities I just never would have had pre-pandemic. Like just, it wouldn't even been on anyone's radar to send an email and be like, hey, can we jump on Zoom real quick?
Right. No, yeah, that is a plus side to some technology like that. Another one that I thought of, and I had a conversation with a friend who he's in the tech space, and he's very much involved with Web3, or at least learning about it. The idea of having war is kind of inevitable, right? It's we as humans we love power and borders and all this stuff. We've kind of created this idea that if you want your certain countries to do certain things, there's probably going to be some wars. But if you could take that and do it in a virtual world, do it in the metaverse, and if you want to have it connected to the economy and all the things that a war would have the effect, but without the lives being lost, I feel like that, again, very abstract, very kind of strange idea. But if we're gonna eventually live in a world where you can have access to schooling and you can kind of get these different avenues, why not do something like that? Again, just some crazy idea I had.
No, it's an interesting thought. And that discussion happens a little bit there's a debate over autonomous weapon systems. So there's people working to build systems that can do firing, shooting decisions, drones that are fully autonomous, guns that can detect enemies and fire upon using facial recognition or other kinds of recognition technology. And this comes up, like, what does it mean for the future of warfare? Because it can, like, people just say, like, why wouldn't we use these things? They can reduce costs of lives. But I think it's a bit more complicated. First of all, we don't know how. So, like, one of the things that incentivizes the end of wars is loss of lives.
Sure.
So people might be more willing to let a war go on, even though you're right that there are real economic impacts are real impacts. They hurt citizens too. People might be more willing to tolerate those than they are loss of lives. But I think another thing is that there are some actors that can afford those things, and there are some actors that cannot. And the same might be true in the metaverse. And in what case you just give a systematic advantage to individuals or groups or citizens or countries that already have systematic advantages. And so the cost of war for them becomes low, but the cost of war for other countries becomes extremely high, and people might take advantage of that new change in dynamics, right? Like, why not just invade this country? They don't have autonomous weapons, or they don't have access to these metaverse resources, but we do. And so it could make the cost of entry to war even lower. So, like, I think the dynamics are totally unknown right now. But it is something to be considered, and it might inform the kinds of limitations we want to put on these things, even though we might want to say, like, we're going to shift warfare towards this kind of thing. Like, it basically just becomes a war of sanctions in that case, right? Like,
sure,
whatever, there's virtual battles going on in the metaverse, but it's really just an economic fight.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another, I guess, point to be made is once corporations start pumping money into these things and realizing that they can sort of create an experience for people.
Yeah.
Wendy's, I don't know if you've heard of it. Wendy's they've jumped on this. They have something called they have something called the Wendy's verse, where you and your friends can, and again, this sounds really lame to me, but you and your friends in the metaverse you can go to Wendy's, you can go to a Wendy's store, you can play basketball with your friends at Wendy's, and this sounds really goofy and kind of, weird. Like, it definitely sounds weird, but it's the base level. And once bigger corporations are able to enhance people's experience and make them feel like they're a part of what it is that they like. Oh, I love Wendy's. I get a 4 for $4, every other day. When I get home, I'm going to put on my Oculus and I'm going to be able to hang out with all my other friends that like Wendy's. And then that turns into, I like the Patriots. So now I can be in the locker room with, I don't follow it anymore, Mac Jones, I feel like once corporations see that they can get people immersed in this, then it's going to run amok again, just like we were talking about.
Yeah, one of the things I worry about, even though I don't work in this space in any sort of primary ways, the ways that corporations come to have a kind of they end up almost like countries or states. And the metaverse just basically creates a new landscape where there's new political boundaries. Of course, they're subject to regulation by external boundaries for now, or external countries and things like that, wherever they're regulated by. But it creates almost like creating new land. And there's going to be political fights and for control over that space. And even outside the metaverse, the more power these companies get, the more they sort of can exert influence over the world, but they're not constrained in the way that states are. Like, states have a very specific purpose, and it's very different than the purpose of a company. And I worry a lot about that difference, like that these companies, their main thing is to generate profit. And so they're not they don't even see themselves as sort of subject to the constraints of government, which is meant to serve people in a certain way. Like, in an idealized way, the point of, or like a legitimate government is one that sort of is organizing systems in order to serve the people that live in it. And that is not the point of corporations, but they might start acting in many ways like states, and they might have power like states. And so I really worry about that.
Yeah, that's actually a great comparison, because just like how people get attached to their hometown or their home state, they can very much get attached to corporations that they use, especially when there's an immersive experience like the metaverse.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, one other topic I wanted to bring up before we start wrapping things up here. When we first met, I wanted to get a gauge on kind of your areas of work, and we definitely spoke a lot about AI and ethics in that realm. But you also spoke a little bit about synthetic biology, which is an area I don't know a ton about, but it is what I do know is it's incredibly interesting. And the main thing that I and a lot of people know about now is the CRISPR technology, which is for you can do a better job of explaining it, but in layman's terms, it sounds like it's gene editing. You're able to switch the biology of an organism to have a certain genetic makeup, maybe more favorable for in my mind, I'm thinking. You can genetically modify animals to have more meat on them, so you get higher margins when you sell them, and that type of thing. I feel like that's one of the main uses of that. I mean,
yeah, we do a pretty good job of that already.
Right.
Yeah, with just standard breeding. But yeah, you're right. That is a use of gene editing for sure. But also some other things like we can golden rice, for example, inserts a gene from carrots. I think it's from carrots into rice for countries where it's impossible to grow carrots. But the I don't know enough about health, but one of the vitamins in carrots prevents blindness in children. Sure. And by inserting this gene into the rice in a place where rice is a main staple of the diet, you can get that, you can prevent a huge number of children from going blind via this. But yeah, you're right. One of the main uses is going to be how do we fatten up cows? Yeah. So synthetic biology. So the way to think about CRISPR is it's like the way we typically would do gene editing in the past, roughly, is like you'd start when there were a very small number of cells, ideally just one, and you'd change the gene you wanted to. What CRISPR lets us do is to go through basically every cell in an organism and switch out the gene. So you can do these kinds of things on beings that already exist. So like one of the ones people worry about, germline. So I could like make a change to all the sperm in your body so that they either carry or don't carry a particular gene, or swap out a gene. So we do a screen on you. It turns out that if you were to have a child, they're very likely to have some genetic predisposition to some disease, Tay-Sachs or something like that. And I can use CRISPR to remove that. Synthetic biology related, I mean, that you might use CRISPR instead. Synthetic biology is basically creating full organisms from scratch. Like, don't take an existing genome and edit it, create the full genome yourself. So I don't know how far along we are in these processes, but the idea is like you create organisms that just don't exist, or we can create copies of organisms that exist, but we want to idealize in a certain kind of way. And they both raise interesting ethical issues. I mean, especially CRISPR and germline editing. Like, one thing is if I make a mistake when editing your germline, that gets carried on to your children. So it's not just that I change your genome to remove some unwanted characteristic or unwanted gene that might be bad for you, but I can mess with the genome, and that can have systemic effects, right? Like, now your children might be carriers for it. It'll be in their genome. And so there's worries about how far that carries forward and what the implications of that are. In the synthetic biology case, I think the issues I've thought about aren't mostly ethical, but sort of, well, they're ethics related, but like, what is the status of we often draw distinctions between living organisms and artifacts, right? Like we treat the natural world in a very different way than we treat forks and spoons. So how should we think about an organism that is also fully an artifact? Like, it's not that we took something from nature and modified it. We just built it from scratch. It does have genes, but we built the genes in this case. And so, like, what does this mean for the way we divide up the world morally? So I've done a lot of thinking about that. I wrote a book on this and like tried to disintegrate that distinction, that we really shouldn't think about artifacts all that differently from organisms, that there's not some deep moral property of living beings that we should be responsive to in ways that we aren't towards artifacts. This is part of an argument I give about why, like, when thinking about our moral obligations, they really start with beings that have consciousness. That's what does the work, or some form of consciousness, not just any consciousness. But
right. Now that is interesting, because we look at inanimate objects as, I mean, that's a rock. It's a rock. Like, whatever. It's a rock. This is a couch. This is a laptop.
Yeah.
But, and then we factor in, we think of living organisms and they're like, all right, that might be an animal, but it has feelings. You can't throw it like you would a rock, you know? And then
Yeah.
you bring up this idea of being able to create an organism. Now, that's artificial life. Is that an inanimate object that we created like you would a table, or is that a living being, or is that somewhere in the middle? It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's right. And what does that mean for us? Like, what does it mean when we've done that kind of thing? Like, what is it? How did it sort of really makes us think about the boundaries that you were just describing. Like, no, I'm assuming most parents like think there's something problematic when their kid takes a magnifying glass to the ants.
Sure.
But like, if the kid goes into the kitchen and bends a fork, they might be mad because they just ruined a fork, but they're not. It's not oriented towards. It's not directed at the. They're like, no, don't do that to the fork. Right. Nobody says that. But this case makes us think, why do we make that distinction? Like, we've got an ant that we built. It's not a robot. I mean, it is there's a certain sense which it is just a robot ant. It's a biological robot, but it's a robot ant. And if we start thinking like, well, we still shouldn't melt it with a magnifying glass, and we think that it's not because it's conscious, like we don't think ants are conscious, or a plant, then we really have to start rethinking that fundamental question of where do we draw these lines?
Yeah. Now, I remember I might have been in middle school when I first even heard about CRISPR. And now it's 10 years later. Where is this technology now? Is this being used on humans?
No, there's basically been a universal ban on applications of CRISPR in humans for now. Now there are some controversies because some scientists in China claim to have used it to remove a genetic defect in some, I think it's some parents before they pass it on to the children, or in the children themselves. I can't exactly remember the details. And that was a massive controversy because there's this universal ban on using it in, at least in germline editing for humans. So that's the last I sort of haven't been following it recently. So it's still in development. It's still in use in all sorts of non-human animal applications, I'm sure. But in humans, we've sort of, and this is, I think there's a lesson to be drawn here for the AI stuff, is like, we can decide to slow down these technologies to make sure we're doing the right thing. We haven't decided to do that in the AI space, but we often in biomedical case, like there's no human cloning. There was like, someone claimed to have cloned a human, and it was a massive controversy. Turned out it wasn't true. Seems like it wasn't true, but they claimed it. And in these spaces where we have these robust ethics ecosystems, we're able to slow down and make sure we're thinking carefully about the ramifications of the applications of these technologies. So I think there's a nice stark contrast there. But yeah, I think currently research is still progressing. It still holds a ton of promise, but we're being careful about how we're going to use it and how we're going to mitigate any risks that come from it.
Yeah, I mean, and it brings us back to the initial point of how there is a fine line with any technology, especially something as life-changing as this. And it's you speaking about that golden rice idea. I mean, that's phenomenal. It's great to be able to get food to people that otherwise wouldn't have it. But where do we draw the line when now, we're editing out genes that we don't find favorable? When a doctor says, hey, your child may have this, we have this new procedure, if you'd like, to go ahead and we can get rid of it. Once that option becomes available, people are going to take it. If it ever does.
And there's a huge debate about that, just in general, the genetic engineering of children or fetuses before to choose for certain characteristics. And I think like one of the main areas of pushback is something like the ways that can express sort of that these traits are problematic and undermine the ability to provide social resources. It's like a lot of conditions, the reason they're bad for the person that has them is because our environment is not set up to make life easy for them, right? Like, so we can almost all problems, like one of my colleagues, I can hear him in the background saying like, these are all socio-technical systems. It's not just about the technology, it's about the social systems they're embedded in. And almost always we have the option of intervening on the social system itself to make life better for people. And so I think one of the core questions we have to ask is when do we intervene at the point of technology, or when do we think more broadly about the social systems the technologies are going to fit into? And that again, it's a question of context, and it's a hard problem. We need to think about each one on sort of a case by case basis. I mean, one of the you mentioned like the bad outcomes. One of the worst outcomes of genetic engineering in plants is that the most common usage is that companies will genetically modify something like corn, so it gives it some property like it's pest resistant, but then they can copyright it, and then if it ends up in some farmer's field, they can sue them for growing their copyrighted corn.
Right. Yeah. No, it's
Copyrighted,
patented. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, once money gets involved and business gets involved, things get hairy. I mean, if it's just science and it's between scientists and it's peer reviewed and everyone, but once it goes out into the world, then I had another professor on here, Professor Dio from Brown University, and he just had a patent that he created for, I think he said it costs like, $2 or something. And what it is, it's in the bioengineering space. It's like a coating that they would put on metal pieces that when someone breaks a bone, a piece of metal is put in there, but it has a coating on it that can detect viruses or parasites or anything. So it's quick. Otherwise you'd have to get a test or something like that. It's very quick, and it kind of hits it right at the source. And
I see.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And he got it.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, he's a phenomenal guy. But and he had another couple patents, and we were talking about how there's this worry that, yes, I want to get it out to the people, but I don't want it to get taken advantage of. It cost me $2 to make. I don't want it to be thrown into some exorbitant. Now it's hundreds of dollars because the companies I've sold it to want to make a profit on it. But I'd rather it be out there so that people could get it. So again, it's once business and money gets involved, it gets sketchy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I mean, this gets back to the theme. One of the recurring themes is like even like patents and copyrights might have been really useful tools in the past for the kinds of inventions and products and outcomes we were developing, but it might be we need to rethink. Like they protected the values we cared about given the context in which we were developing things, but now we need to rethink them. In the case of bioengineering and patents, like the patents developed for invention devices, things like that, don't seem like the best way to think about protecting inventions in the bioengineering space. And copyright, copyright may have been great for sort of music and books, but now as we're thinking about, AI that generates music and books, like maybe the way we thought about copyright before is not the best way to do it. So it's like we really have to do a reimagining of how we're going to protect the values we care about. Like we all, a lot of us agree on the sort of our core values, like autonomy. We want to protect autonomy. We want to protect welfare. We want to protect fairness. But we need to think about how to do that we then what we do is we entrench certain ways of thinking about protecting those values, and then it's hard for us to rethink the protections. We equate the protections with the value itself, and so now we just need a whole rethinking in the face of these emerging technologies.
Sure. Well, hey John, this was a really great conversation. I hope a lot of people hear it.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you bet. And we'll do it again. We'll definitely do it again later on down the road. Before we go, do you have anything that you're working on? Where can people find you? I heard you earlier you mentioned you wrote a book. Where can people find that?
Yeah, sure. I do have a book. It's definitely written for philosophers. There's no attempt to make things publicly accessible. But you can check it on Amazon. It's called The Death of the Ethic of Life. It's very expensive, and you shouldn't probably don't. It's probably not that interesting to people. But the Northeastern Ethics Institute has a website where we often will post some things we're working on that might be of interest to people, and some interesting things in the AI space, especially that are going on. And so people might want to check that out. But nothing really to plug that I'm working on or anything.
Yeah, no problem. Again, definitely appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I think we're done. Talk to you guys on Monday. Hey, I'm back to reiterate all the stuff that I said at the top of the show. Follow and subscribe. Bye-bye.